Shalom and welcome to the introduction to the book of Hebrews, a major theme of which is drawing near to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, to Adonai, our creator, because it is our creator's heart from the very beginning to draw us near. And he made a system by which to draw us near. And we see a system that he made on earth, and he also made a system in the heavenlies. But for this reason, the book of Hebrews is often misunderstood and is a very complicated and confusing book for a lot of people. So I'm going to do my best to explain some of the reasons for this and to try to spur some of the confusion regarding this book. But for that reason, this will also probably be a little bit longer of a study. So I would encourage you, if you have some chores to do, or if you have some drives to make to or from work, you can always listen to part of the study and come back and listen to the later part of the study. But it's important to make sure that you listen to the full study so you can be sure to understand if you've ever felt like you've not completely understood the book of Hebrews. I also want to take this opportunity to put a plug in for Tim Hague of Torah Resource Institute, because it's when I read his commentary on the book of Hebrews that I felt like I finally understood what the author of the book of Hebrews intended his message to be. And you can find this two-part volume at TorahResource.com. It's about $40. For $35, you can get the downloaded version and also the audio that comes along with it, where Tim is speaking his commentary and discussing it. So I cannot recommend this commentary enough. I feel like it would be great if everyone would read it, and it would probably resolve a lot of the confusion surrounding this book. Let's talk about the timeline of the writing of the book of Hebrews. You can see there it's around the same time that 2 Peter, 2 Timothy, and Jude are being written. It's believed it's somewhere in the years directly preceding the destruction of the temple, because if you read the book of Hebrews, it's the author is discussing the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, it's also known as, and the sacrificial system. So you would think if the destruction of the temple by the Romans had just happened in the recent past, the author would surely have brought that up considering his content, but he doesn't. And he still speaks of the priesthood and the sacrifices in the present tense, as if the sacrifices are still in the process of being made at this time. So that's one of the reasons why it's thought that the book of Hebrews was written right before 70 AD. We also know from the text that Timothy is still alive and part of the ministry and traveling at that time. But ultimately, the setting, the name of the book of Hebrews, the author, and the audience are all relatively mysterious and not well understood, as I will describe here. So the name, we call it the book of Hebrews. But it's interesting that the term Judaioi or Hebraioi for Jew or Hebrew is not actually in the text of the entire book. So where did this name come from? I'll talk about that in a second. But think about that. If the name is not in the text, but we call the text the book of Hebrews, do you think it might kind of frame how we read the book that's called the book to the Hebrews? What if it wasn't actually written to the Hebrews? Does that change how you might interpret the message that then comes out in the text? Just something to think about. Who is the author? Well, most of the epistles, as we've read, we see that the author identifies himself at the beginning of the letter in the address to the audience. But this text does not have that sort of introduction. So it's not known in the text who the author is, and many authors have been proposed. For the longest time, many thought that it was Paul. There's different reasons for that, and I'll talk about that here at the end of this slide. But some of these other men have been suggested as possible authors of the text. We know that whoever wrote this text was very eloquent in Greek, just based on the usage of the Greek, the vocabulary used, the style used. This was someone who's very knowledgeable in the Greek language and very highly educated in the Greek way of speaking and writing. This person was an expert in the Tanakh, or what's commonly known as the Old Testament. The Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim is an acronym meaning law, prophets, and writings, or Hebrew scriptures, because the content of the book of Hebrews presumes a particular knowledge about Leviticus, specifically the sacrificial system, the priesthood, the prophecies of the Hebrew scriptures. The way this person speaks, it seems pretty clear this is a well-known leader in the community, and we know that he was an acquaintance of Timothy. So some different writers of the early centuries had their opinions regarding who wrote this epistle. Like Tertullian around the year 200 AD thought it was written by Barnabas, who was a Levite. So you can see how he might be considered for the authorship of this text. This comes from the Jewish Annotated New Testament Commentary, which was interesting. It says, it, meaning the book of Hebrews, gradually began circulating with Paul's letters. So this was a gradual thing that took place. And in a 3rd century manuscript, it follows Romans directly. So then it, kind of became presumed that it was written by Paul. And here in this manuscript evidence of the 3rd century is where we first find the title "To the Hebrews," although it's not known why that title is there. And it's kind of like a superscript to the text, not in the text itself. The church, the assembly, as it grew into the Roman Empire, there was a strong presence in the west of the empire, in Rome, strong presence in the east, more towards Asia Minor and Israel. In the east, this text was accepted fairly early on as Paul's 14th epistle. There's 13 other epistles that we know are written by Paul, and this was considered in the east, just accepted that this was Paul's 14th epistle, whereas in the west, it wasn't considered with that authority until around 400 AD when Jerome and Augustine came around. But most scholars now disagree that Paul wrote this text, because there's just such a stark difference in the Greek style and grammar and vocabulary that's used in this text by comparison to Paul's other writings as well. What about the audience? Well, again, in the introduction, or lack of introduction, I guess I should say, there's no one identified that is the audience or the recipients of this text. And that term "to the Hebrews" didn't appear for a couple hundred years. So again, does this change how we interpret this text if we accept that it was written only to Hebrew people, for instance, by this title, "To the Hebrews"? So is that something that we're reading into the text rather than allowing the text to teach us? We have to be very careful about that. But for this reason, and based on the content, some of the content describing the priesthood according to Aaron versus the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, which is Yeshua's priesthood, our Messiah, and how his priesthood is greater and better than, many have combined these couple pieces of information and presumed that what the author of the book of Hebrews is doing is trying to warn the Hebrews or the Jewish people not to shrink back into Judaism. And so, to use a term like shrink back, let us not shrink back. Some of the commentaries say that this means don't shrink back into Judaism, but you can see how this is kind of read into the text. And why do I say this? Well, what I mentioned already about applying this context of "to the Hebrews" when we're not quite certain that's what it meant in the first place. And also the internal text of the content directly preceding the statement in chapter 10:38, which is regarding turning back to sin. So let us not shrink back in reference to turning back into sin. the author talks about warning them against their immature spiritual understanding, gives evidence for part of the context of them not shrinking back because of immaturity. And there's many warnings about their immature spiritual condition, or warning not to fall away because of a poor spiritual condition. So these sorts of statements are prolific throughout the content of the book of Hebrews, whereas this presumption about Judaizing or returning to Judaism and this sort of thing is much more read into the text. This sort of understanding about presuming this is a call out of Judaism is also in conflict with the rest of Scripture. And we're reading the Scriptures chronologically, which I would highly recommend for everyone because it keeps the story in context as the story is playing out. As the divine revelation is being given from Adonai to mankind, we're getting the story laid out for us. So we have to remember that the writing of the book of Hebrews is very, very, very late. This is one of the last books written before the end of our scriptures comes to an end. What about all the scripture, all the divine revelation that has preceded the book of Hebrews? Are we really to take an interpretation, an understanding of the book of Hebrews that is in conflict with the trajectory of everything else that preceded it? And what do I mean by that? Well, the Tanakh foundation, the foundation of the Hebrew scriptures. In general, we could look at a text like Deuteronomy 29, which Adonai is making his covenant with Jew and Gentile and admonishing his people, not just those standing here, but all who would enter into covenant with him in the future, to keep all the words of this Torah. So that just demonstrates the continual nature of the Torah, of God's law. And in regard to the priesthood and the sacrifices, Adonai, our creator, says in Exodus 40 and in Jeremiah 33 and many other places, the continual nature, the perpetual nature, the forever nature of the Aaronic priesthood. What about Yeshua's words in Matthew 5? These key words of our Messiah that said not one jot or tittle, not the smallest letter or the least stroke of a pen will disappear from the Torah until all is accomplished, until heaven and earth pass away. And what about the apostles admonishing Jew and Gentile to pursue Torah and learn Torah each Shabbat? How the apostles were offering animal sacrifices approximately 30 years after the resurrection of our Messiah Yeshua. We see that in Acts 21. How in 1 Timothy, Paul admonishes Timothy to maintain the sound doctrine which is in alignment with our Messiah Yeshua's words. So therefore, back to Matthew 5 and what Messiah says about the Torah, and how Peter, the last few verses of his second epistle, he admonishes us to be careful with Paul's words, not to fall into the error of lawlessness and misunderstand Paul, so that we would no longer walk in the law, essentially. So we have to remember all of this. The book of Hebrews is stacked on top of. We cannot get rid of all the scriptures that preceded this or come up with an interpretation of the author to the book of Hebrews intent that is different or contradictory to the divine revelation of our Creator that preceded it. The style of the book of Hebrews, it's more like a sermon or an essay, a theological essay, than it is a letter. Kind of like the book of Romans. It's like a theological essay with making some decisive points of logic along the way, and it has a goal in mind, and it proceeds along that goal. It's very, very highly educated kind of style of Greek oration and writing and speaking, unparalleled in the rest of the apostolic writings. So whoever wrote this was highly educated in Koine Greek, as I mentioned earlier. We have to remember that the strategy and the literary devices that the author is using is of prophetic typology, meaning it's like a foreshadowing, or some people call it a type and shadow of something else to come. But many have interpreted this type of writing in the book of Hebrews as one thing replaces the other, which is not correct, according to what I just said about that would put it in conflict with the rest of the scriptures. But we see this type and shadow kind of language and examples that are being used in things like the tabernacle. Which was modeled after a heavenly version, scripture tells us. Same thing with the priesthood of Aaron, is a type and shadow of the priesthood of Messiah Yeshua, who is the high priest, but not according to the tribe of Levi. The sacrifices, cleansing, all of it is a shadow of something else, a type and shadow, not being replaced by something else. So there's a literary device, a Hebraic logic called kal v'chomer, and it means light and heavy. So we see statements making comparisons like, if this, then how much more that? So it's comparing things, not saying one replaces the other, but one is greater than the other. And there's many examples of this. I just gave a few. So comparative language rather than contradictory language. So when a change is discussed, it needs to be understood as a difference is being described, not a replacement, for instance, of the priesthood or of the law. It's a change of meaning, a difference or a change in perspective even. You can see it that way, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Comparative language meaning better than. One is better than the other, or to use that kal v'chomer type of language, if this is good, how much better is that over there? Comparative language. The author describes a first sort of situation and a second sort of situation. So a comparison, there's a first meaning a temporal part of this earthly realm according to the lineage of Aaron, and there's a second which is of an eternal realm according to the order of Melchizedek, or if you have difficulty pronouncing that Melchizedekian word, you can say maybe a messianic priesthood opposed to the Aaronic priesthood. But it's comparing two things, not replacing one thing for another. Also, we have to keep in mind the Greek verbs, because we're familiar in English language about tense, meaning when did something occur, past, present, or future. But Greek is what's called an aspect dominant language. An aspect we have in English, but we don't really define it well. And that has to do much more with the observation of the action and how it took place from the viewpoint of the author. And I know that's a little bit confusing if you're not used to it, but you just have to be aware that these sorts of things are happening in the Greek verb tenses. So being careful about seeing something in just past or present when it can be a continual nature of the verbs and the actions that are being described. So I'm not going to read through this whole slide just for the sake of time. You can pause the video and look at some of the details here regarding how often these words are used, but look at the underlined words in English: heavenly, perfect, better, and faith or trust. And you can see, just because the author makes a regular use of these terms, you can see some of the emphasis that the author is getting at. He's going to spend a lot of time talking about a heavenly realm, of course, by comparison to an earthly realm. He's going to talk about this process of making humans perfect, of being perfected or fulfilled, completed in a process, and how that actually takes place. How one thing is better than another thing. This heavenly being perfected, of course, is better than the earthly or the things that are temporary. And of course, where our ultimate trust lies. In whom does our ultimate trust lie for being perfected? So let's talk about a difficult passage just to kind of emphasize my point of some of the conflict that has arose from the book of Hebrews and and why many are confused by what the text is actually saying. So I'm just using this example. I pulled a few verses that are kind of surrounding the same subject, and I'll go ahead and read it here. And you can see in red that I'm pulling forth some of the common themes from those several words, those 4 words from the previous slide, to show that the author is using these sorts of words to make his point. Now, if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also. For on the one hand, there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope, through which we draw near to God. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make perfect those who draw near. So you can see some of the author's points in using this type of terminology. And I have that word on the bottom right only in brackets because that actually does not appear in the Greek text, in the Greek manuscripts, but many English translations have it. And you can pause the video and read that with and without that word. And you can see how that sheds a condescending light on the law itself. And it surely influences the reader's perspective on the law by having that word versus not having it. But what I want to focus on is this underlined phrase regarding change. Priesthood is changed, law is changed. What does this mean if, as I said before, change doesn't mean replacement of? So let's look at this word change, which in Greek is metatitheme. It's seen 5 times in the Greek text, in the apostolic writings. And each time we see how it indicates a difference of something, a difference of location or a difference of perspective. So outside our example here in the book of Hebrews, which I just read, that passage, we find this word in the book of Acts regarding the bones of the forefathers being moved to a different tomb. So change of location, a different location, or Enoch being taken up to a different location. We see in Galatians 1 how the perspective of the Messiah and who the Messiah is being changed into another perspective of this supposed Messiah, which really in all actuality doesn't exist. Or the change in perspective of what grace actually is and is designed to be, but rather this other perspective these people have turned it into licentiousness or license to sin is what that word means. So each time it indicates a difference, whether location or perspective. But in each case, the object itself doesn't actually change. It's the perspective of it that does. So in the same way, when we read change of law, it doesn't mean one law comes to an end and is replaced by a new one. Remember, that would be in conflict with the rest of the Tanakh and in conflict with what our Messiah Yeshua says at the beginning of his longest sermon, Sermon on the Mount. But rather, change is more in the sense of perspective, recognizing a difference between two things, an apparent change. The author of Hebrews emphasizes that there are 2 different priesthoods occurring in 2 different realms, operating in according to 2 different standards or laws, because they are for the purpose of 2 different goals. And in this way, seeing a difference between these 2 is to recognize a change, not a conflict, but a recognition that the latter is greater or better than the former. So let's talk about that better. Does what is better necessarily invalidate or replace what is lesser? Think about that logically. Does what is greater necessarily invalidate what is lesser? And I think the answer is no. But let me give you an example. My wife is named Denise, and I could ask the question, what's better, Denise or our wedding ring that I wear every day? What's better, Denise or our marriage vows that her great aunt calligraphed in a very beautiful way and we have framed in our house. What's better, Denise or the photo album that we have of all of our wedding anniversaries together? What's better? Well, Denise, of course. These all are shadows of Denise. Therefore, since all of these are shadows, should we trash them all? No, but it would be wrong to value any of these more than or to the neglect of Denise herself, would it not? In the same way, what's better, Adonai or the Sabbath? What's better, Adonai or the Torah or the tabernacle or the animal sacrifices? Well, Adonai is better. Of course he is better. These are shadows of him. Therefore, since these are shadows, should we trash them all? Trash the Sabbath, trash the Torah, trash the tabernacle and the animal sacrifices? No, but it would be wrong to value these more than or to the neglect of Adonai himself. And I think this makes sense. And I think we see examples in scripture and through history of times when people actually did this. They valued the shadows more than the actual. But of course, that doesn't make the shadows bad. That makes the use of them or the perspective of them off and incorrect and leading to great error. Here are some other examples of things where the heavenly is greater than the earthly. For instance, our Messiah is symbolized by bread and wine, as he did in his at the Passover time in his last meal with his disciples before he laid down his life. So obviously, his body and his blood are better than the bread and the wine which symbolizes him. Therefore, we should never have the bread or the wine again to make that symbol. No, of course we should, but we should recognize that the actual is better than the lesser. Here's another example, our heavenly body. We will have an incorruptible body. Therefore, our earthly body doesn't matter at all. We can trash it, treat it however we want, put junk into it, not take care of it. No, that's not true. But the heavenly body is surely greater than the earthly body. And there's other examples I have here that you can consider. So let's talk about what the animal sacrifices actually did, because I think a lot of people don't understand and have different ideas about what they actually did or didn't do, which then skews the perspective of what Yeshua's sacrifice actually did and didn't do, and what and how they're related. So a lot of people think if the animal sacrifices took away sin, then Yeshua's sacrifice replaces any need for them because it was a sacrifice once for all that took away all sin, the ultimate sacrifice. And on the surface, this logic makes sense. Many people believe that before Yeshua Messiah came, God established a system of animal sacrifice. When people sinned, they brought an animal and they offered up the animal and their sins were forgiven. So then when Messiah Yeshua comes, he lays down his life as the ultimate sacrifice for sin. Makes sense. No more need for animal sacrifices. But is that really logical? Think about this for a second. If the animal sacrifices really did take away sin, then that means Yeshua's sacrifice actually is not truly needed, because people could continue to make animal sacrifices. If the sacrifice actually took away sin and drew mankind to Adonai eternally, then technically mankind could continue to make sacrifices till the end of time, and that would be sufficient to draw them near to Adonai eternally. But that equates the power and the value of the blood of the Son of God with the blood of an animal, saying they are just as good. And that would create two ways to the Father. But Yeshua says, I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. Animal sacrifices could never do that. And we wouldn't want to disrespect him by presuming that they have the same potency as the very lifeblood of the Son of God. So besides that not making logical sense, It's not scripturally accurate, because Paul says to the Galatians in regard to the Torah, but of course, the sacrificial system is part of the Torah. If these things were sufficient to draw mankind near to God eternally, the Messiah died in vain. He died for nothing. Why would he come to die, except maybe for our convenience? Yeah, God, it was really annoying to have to bring those sacrifices all the time. Thanks so much for taking that burden off of us. Now we don't have to make sacrifice anymore. That's nice and easy. Of course, we would never think such a silly thing, that God sent his precious son to die just simply for our convenience. Messiah, Yeshua, surely did not die for nothing. Besides that, the author to the Hebrews in the text that we're studying blatantly says the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. So we can't presume that before Messiah Yeshua came, they actually did. They did not. Okay. So that's one error people make. The error on the other side is jerking the wheel into the ditch on the other side of the road and saying, well, if they don't do anything, then why were they prescribed, at that time through Adonai to Moses in the Torah for the rest of the time of mankind? And a lot of people, especially nowadays, say, more importantly, why would we ever think that they would be prescribed for us again to offer animal sacrifices? So let's talk about what I have here are 3 functions of the animal sacrifices, what the animal sacrifices did, the functions that they performed. So pay very close attention to this slide, because this gets complex. The author in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, says that the animal sacrifices purified the flesh. Now, this doesn't mean they make your hands clean. This isn't talking about purity, purifying as far as having clean hands so you don't get germs when you eat or something along those lines. This is in reference to ritual purity, because remember, Adonai said to tell Moses, to tell the people, let them make a sanctuary for me that I may dwell in their midst. And so the tabernacle was constructed, and the very presence of the creator of the universe dwelled in the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle. And he gave very specific instructions regarding how people were to approach in the tabernacle setting, in the tabernacle structure. And you could not approach him if you were ritually unclean. So in Hebrew, the terms are tahor for clean and tameh for unclean. And that's a hard English translation, because people assign a moral or immoral sense to those words, or even like a feeling shamed or something along those lines if they're unclean. So I've heard a pastor say, think of it as ready, not ready. Ready to come to Adonai's presence, not ready to come to Adonai's presence. But this is a change of ritual status, what the animal sacrifices caused. And I use that term cause very intentionally. The animal sacrifices caused a change in status of clean or unclean, ready or not ready. It's a ritual purity issue. This is what the animal sacrifices caused. And this is what the author to the book of Hebrews in chapter 9 says. The animal sacrifices also function as a shadow. In other words, they illustrate how sin would be removed, the author says in chapter 10. But that doesn't mean they're the cause of the removal of the sin. They're an illustration. Remember the prophetic foreshadowing, the type and the shadow. They demonstrate the method or the way that sin would be removed as a prophetic picture for us. So they're the symbol of the method that I will just, I've summarized here, that lifeblood of an innocent substitute is required to pay my sin debt. The animal sacrifices illustrate that for us, but that doesn't mean they cause the debt of sin to be paid, if you can get my point there. And this third point is even more delicate, and and is a very, very fine line we have to be careful with when I use the term forgiveness. So I explain it in this way, that the animal sacrifices were a physical expression of a spiritual reality. And I'm thankful that we have the ritual of baptism that we're familiar with, because I think it's a very close analogy to what I mean about this physical expression of a spiritual reality. Very close analogy to the animal sacrifice. So think about this. Someone who believes and repents and is baptized, as the apostles exhort us in the scriptures, they could go underneath the surface of the water with a pure heart and receive Adonai's grace for this process of repentance in doing so. But someone else with a hardened heart could do the same action and go under the water and come out. And the result from God's perspective is this person just took a dip in the water, just got wet. This did not cause, baptism did not cause the grace of God to be given. It didn't force God's hand, so to speak, just because this ritual was done. So you can see how I'm relating that to the animal sacrifice, that the bringing of an offering does not cause forgiveness, okay? But it's a physical expression of a heart posture of a spiritual reality, which is real. So the reason this is important is because in the Torah, in Leviticus 4-6, Adonai, our creator, says when this worshiper brings the appropriate animal sacrifice for sin, 9 times in these several chapters, it specifically says that the worshiper is forgiven. So this leads people, if they're not understanding the full picture here, to think that the animal sacrifices caused the forgiveness. But we know from other texts that that's not the case, that it's a physical expression of a spiritual reality, not the cause itself, because we know that we're forgiven by grace through faith. It's God's grace that he provided this animal sacrifice option in the first place. And in our bringing this animal and going through this ritual process of spilling this animal's lifeblood and it going upon the altar, we actually had to have faith and trust that that really did something, that really was what Adonai asked us to do, and faith that he's going to forgive us. We didn't necessarily know how all that would work, because how can a just God forgive sinners? He is just. The wages of sin is death. There has to be some sort of payment in the spiritual realm to make God a just God and also merciful in giving grace to those who do not deserve it. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So I have a couple points here to pay very close attention to. The grace or the forgiveness of Adonai to the humble worshiper does not mean that the animal blood caused that grace or forgiveness. Okay? Pay close attention to that statement and chew on that. It also doesn't require that the worshiper had a perfect understanding of the real cause of their grace and forgiveness in order to be forgiven and receive that, because they wouldn't have known at this time. This is approximately 1,500 years before Messiah Yeshua. You know, did it require everyone's perfect understanding of that which hadn't happened yet in order to be forgiven? Or did it require their humble approach and trust that they would be forgiven because Adonai said so, and we wouldn't find out for 1,500 years the actual spiritual mechanics of Messiah's sacrifice, which is the cause of our ability to be forgiven. I hope that makes sense. The distinction between what the animal sacrifices do cause, that being purification of the flesh, versus what they facilitate as number 3, a physical expression of a spiritual reality, but not the cause. Okay, so let's look at the difference between the priesthoods and the functions of these two systems, which run in parallel. I like to think of them like railroad tracks, parallel, operating at the exact same time, and never crossing each other. And as soon as we start to cross wires, so to speak, that's when the misunderstandings come in. That's when the errors are made, when we try to use things in one column and apply them to things in the second column. So that's why I have it written here in two separate columns, so we can see how they are parallel and they actually operate simultaneously for God-given reasons that don't conflict each other. So let's talk about the first, the Aaronic, the priesthood according to Aharon or Aaron, which the author to the book of Hebrews calls first. This is a situation for earth, for mankind on earth. The tabernacle was made by humans, and it is Aaron and his sons who are the mediators, the priests in this earth system. Going through this process allows the worshiper entrance into the temple courtyard on earth, and that's through animal lifeblood, but it's temporal, it's temporary. It's in just according to while men are alive, mankind is alive on earth. Even when these sacrifices are brought, sin and death still reigns in this earth. People still die. People still sin. There's still pain. There's still negative things happening because death is still reigning. There's only a partial bringing near of mankind. We still can't see God's face on earth. He says, no one can see my face and live, because this is regarding ritual purity of the flesh, so that in our flesh bodies that are corrupted by sin and death, we can approach the creator of the universe in this tabernacle on earth. Okay, that's the first. Let's look at the second. Let's call it the Messianic priesthood, or according to the order of Melchizedek. This is a system in the heavenlies, not of this earthly realm. This was a system, a tabernacle made by Adonai himself, not made with the hands of man. The mediator, the priesthood, is our great high priest, is the son of Adonai himself, Yeshua, our Messiah. And we are brought by his blood into the very throne room, not just the courtyard as it is in the earthly tabernacle. And of course, this is for all of eternity, not just temporally, because Yeshua's sacrifice conquered death. So life does reign, and death has no more sting according to this priesthood and according to this situation in this realm of things, at which time there will be no more separation. We will see his face, it says in the last chapter of Revelation, whereas before we could not see the face of Adonai and live, because this priesthood operates to purify us internally, our hearts, our conscience, the very core of our being, not just our flesh suits while we're on earth. So you can see that both of these are established by God, ordained by God for the purposes of God, which are not the same exact purposes. So therefore they are not in conflict, and they both operate at the same time. Of course, the second is better, just as the author in the book of Hebrews says, but they are not in conflict. Therefore, Yeshua's work and his sacrificial work does not negate the system that existed given by Adonai to Moses in the Torah. Okay, let's look at a couple other examples regarding temporal versus eternal cleansing. And these are the terms that Tim Hegg uses in his commentary, temporal versus eternal. Whereas in the last slide I had Aaronic versus Messianic. These are just different terms to identify which system that we're talking about here. So think of every combination that we could have when we're talking these two systems operating at the same time. You can have temporally clean and unclean, and you can have eternally clean or unclean in whatever combination. So look at this top example. A person can be temporally clean, but eternally unclean. Let's think of an example how that might be. So there's things in the Torah that it says, if you do these things, you will be unclean. For example, you touch a dead body, or you touch a corpse of an unclean animal, or something like that. You are unclean, and usually it prescribes that you immerse in a mikveh, a collection of waters, and you wait until evening, which is sundown, and sometimes it requires a particular sacrifice, an offering to be brought, and then you will be clean. So this is a ritual purity situation that we're being described. But in this example, imagine someone who maintained that ritual purity, but they had a hardened heart. So in this sense, they would be temporally clean, and they, according to Adonai's word, could come bring an offering into the tabernacle, or later the temple in Jerusalem. But Adonai, knowing their heart, which is hardened against him, and his Messiah Yeshua, that creates the situation where they're temporarily clean but eternally unclean. They would never be able to, after they left this life, approach Adonai eternally in his throne room, no matter how temporally clean they were, because that is operating in a different system. What about the opposite? Someone who is temporally unclean but eternally clean. One example I thought of is when a woman gives birth to a child. Scripture says that she is ritually unclean. No sin has taken place. She is ritually unclean, but if this is a woman who is following Adonai and Messiah Yeshua with all their heart, with a humble heart, they have entered and been cleansed eternally according to the Messianic priesthood, according to that second system. So in this sense, a person could be temporally unclean, but eternally clean. And these, just illustrating, these are not the same systems. These are not the same issues that are being managed by these two systems. So we can't cross them. Tim Hegg uses an example. We can have a good relationship with a neighbor, but not have a good relationship with Adonai. Or we can have good relationship with Adonai and not have much of a relationship with a neighbor. One doesn't mean the other, or one doesn't cause the other necessarily, and one doesn't necessarily negate the other. They are operating, one in a realm of being on earth and engaging with other humans, and the other engaging with the creator of the universe. And that's not a perfect example, but it just demonstrates you can have these two systems operating at the same time. So I just want to re-emphasize the problems with this antinomian replacement theology. Antinomian means anti-namas, and namas is the Greek word for law. So anti-law or anti-Torah replacement theology, it just simply does not work. And we cannot use that sort of mindset to interpret the book of Hebrews and apply that onto what the author of the book of Hebrews intends by his words. And again, this is based on the foundation of all the scriptures which preceded this book, including Yeshua's own words about the Torah, including Ezekiel's description of the temple and the animal sacrifices that are to be made in a temple yet to be built during the millennial kingdom. That's the latter chapters of Ezekiel, including the apostles making animal sacrifices 30 years approximately after Messiah Yeshua's death and resurrection. But really, this should not surprise us if we don't believe that the Torah has been replaced. And to use an illustration, some have seen this already, this pie chart shows the percentages of the Torah that apply to certain people. I have a star down here where the priesthood is. You can see it's approximately a quarter. So if Yeshua says not the smallest letter or least stroke of a pen will disappear from the Torah, well, the animal sacrificial system in the Aaronic priesthood is certainly more than a letter or a stroke of the pen of the Torah, just to use that visual pie chart there to demonstrate that. So we can't go back and ignore Messiah Yeshua's words and believe such things about a replacement of the Aaronic priesthood, or that there's no longer any animal sacrifice. Also remember that the sin and the guilt offerings are only 2 out of the 5 sacrificial categories mentioned in the entry chapters of the book of Leviticus. There are still the fellowship offering, the meal offering or grain offering, and the whole burnt offering. Those 3 are the other categories of sacrificial offerings that literally have zero to do with any sin or wrongdoing or transgression or iniquity or anything at all. So what about those? If Messiah Yeshua's sacrifice for sin nullified any need for any more sacrifices, what about the sacrifices that don't have anything to do with sin? So see, it just doesn't add up to have that train of logic. Let's remember that the theme of the book of Hebrews is about drawing near to Adonai, and that's his heart from the beginning. We've been focusing on my second point here, that he is a greater priest, but let's not forget that the excitement of the apostles, and particularly this author, in demonstrating Adonai's desire to draw us near from the very beginning, that a sacrifice was made since the time of coming out of the garden, demonstrating Adonai's desire to draw near to his people. And this starts by demonstrating that Messiah Yeshua is greater than any man. And he's described in divine terms as deity, the creator, who upholds the world and sustains the world. Yet he's made a human. So there's a parallel, you can see a parallel there to us as humans. But he's more than angels, he's more than a man, he's more than a prophet, he's more than a priest. Who could possibly qualify for that kind of description? Obviously, these are descriptions of deity. We've been talking about how this one, of course, has a greater priesthood. So superior to the Aaronic priesthood, but parallel. We talked about how his is the actual cause of the removal of sin, whereas the Aaronic priesthood was the shadow. It's a prophetic illustration. His is an eternal cause, whereas the Aaronic priesthood was operating in things that are temporal. He's sinless. There's a better covenant. There's a heavenly tabernacle. It's a sacrifice once for all. All of these demonstrate his greater priesthood. And the author of Hebrews exhorts us, based on these true things that the apostle wants us to understand, he then exhorts our behavior. Understand who we're talking about here as Yeshua, who is the creator, and of his priesthood and all that he has done for you, and to make an eternal way for you. Therefore, run with perseverance. And he warns us and exhorts us to live by faith, which means action. All those examples in Hebrews chapter 11 are by faith, and then someone did something. They demonstrated their faith by what they did. So we are either going to obey and live accordingly, or we are going to rebel and therefore fall. So don't let anyone tell you that faith and works don't go hand in hand. By faith, we obey. And we are to live in such a way as our Messiah Yeshua did. And how did he live? A righteous life. He lived in obedience to God's law, not in rebellion to God's law. He is our perfect example. So of course we are to follow his example and follow suit and walk in Adonai's Torah as he did. There's going to be difficulties in this world. We are going to undergo persecution, but the author describes this as also discipline, which strengthens us, just like a father disciplines a child and uses things in this world to strengthen us, to focus on him and to keep our eyes on him, keep our eyes on the hope that we have in his eternal kingdom, which he has described in a lot of detail for the preceding chapters in the book of Hebrews. So this is how we are to keep our eyes on Yeshua and to walk as Yeshua walked, as the Apostle John will later say. So to summarize, let's go over these points one more time so you can see them all together. A sacrifice for sin. The animal sin sacrifice symbolizes sin removal and cleansing to draw near Yehovah on earth. That's what the animal sacrifice, one of the three things the animal sacrifice did. Yeshua's sacrifice, however, is the actual sin removal and cleansing to draw near to Adonai in the heavenly realm. Why did Adonai command the sin sacrifice in the first place? And here's those three things: to purify the flesh, the animal sacrifice causes ritual purity for the tabernacle or temple on earth. Number two, they serve as a shadow, which is a prophetic picture to teach and point to how Yeshua's sacrifice works, how Adonai would forgive sinners. And number three, they serve in, as far as forgiveness goes, as a physical expression which facilitates the inner spiritual reality, not the actual cause of forgiveness, but a physical expression that facilitates the spiritual reality, the cause of which we know is from Messiah Yeshua's sacrifice. So then why did Adonai say people who brought sin sacrifices were forgiven? Because Adonai sees the humble heart. He is the only one who knows that when someone with a humble heart is following his instruction after they have sinned and they desire reconciliation with him, he sees that humility and gives grace to the humble, as the scripture says, and chooses to forgive them. It's not actually the animal sacrifice that did it, it's the humble heart following obediently to reconcile, by which Adonai gives grace. So why do we need Yeshua if Adonai forgave sinners in this way? Well, the animals illustrated that an innocent substitute was needed for this reconciliation process, for the forgiveness and cleansing. But Yeshua is the actual substitute, which is the cause of our forgiveness and the payment for our forgiveness, whereas the animals were the symbol, not the actual cause. So why would we continue sin sacrifices after Yeshua's death and resurrection? Because the Aaronic priesthood and the Messianic priesthoods, the system 1 and the system 2, the temporal and the eternal systems, they're different. They're not for the same purposes. So therefore, they're not in conflict because they operate at the same time for their different purposes. And also because points 1, 2, and 3 I made before about the cleansing of the flesh, the prophetic symbol, and how they facilitate physically what the spiritual reality is, how those remain true. Still, after Messiah Yeshua's sacrifice, those three still remain true. They were true before and they're still true. But many think that they were only true before because they prophetically point forward to Yeshua's offering. But don't the things that we practice and the things that we celebrate, don't they function both prophetically looking forward and in a memorializing sense as we look back towards them? So, in other words, these things in scripture can teach us of what's coming, and they can remind us of what's already past, can they not? Here's a couple examples that we're used to in our culture. When a woman is pregnant, husband and wife are counting the months or maybe the weeks leading up to the birth of their child. And then what happens afterwards? After this event that they have been looking forward to, this wonderful event, there's a celebration of birthdays, which is the annual memorial of the birth event that they were looking forward to, counting up to. What about a romantic relationship? We count the years or the weeks or the months or whatever that we're courting or dating our significant other. And then after the wedding day, we celebrate the anniversaries of our wedding day, the anniversaries of our covenant vows, and that's called an anniversary. So we memorialize what we had looked forward to, and in celebration of that, we are reminded year after year after year. So you can see how it can come from both directions. It doesn't, the celebration and the significance of the symbol doesn't end at the significant event. It goes on in a memorial sort of fashion. Let's remember the words of our Messiah Yeshua, who specifically said regarding the Torah, a great amount of which, more than 25% approximately, regards the sacrificial system. Let's remember his words. He said, until heaven and earth pass away. Well, heaven and earth have not passed away. And he challenges us, not one letter or least stroke of the pen will disappear from the Torah until all is accomplished. And then he says, therefore, I tell you, my disciples, whoever practices and does these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever teaches and against them and ignores them will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So it's clear what he wants from his disciples until heaven and earth pass away. So I want to leave you with one final illustration before we close. A man loves a woman and asks her to marry him at some unknown date in the near future. Holding out a ring, he asks her to wear it forever as a symbol of his love for her and her heart commitment to him. She says yes and accepts the ring, wondering when and how he will come to marry her. When she slides the ring on her finger, the man is ecstatic. But why? Isn't a ring just a shiny rock on a dinky piece of metal? But what does her wearing of the ring demonstrate to him? Heart commitment. Now, does wearing the ring cause the heart commitment? No. But still, should wearing the ring ever cease to symbolize her heart commitment to him? No. So, when the long-awaited wedding day comes and he takes her to be his wife, should she then cease to wear the ring which symbolizes his love for her and her commitment to him? Amen. May you be blessed in the reading of the book of Hebrews. Shalom.